Louis Zamperini. Survival is rarely a single act of courage. More often, it is 1,000 small refusals to die, repeated until the body simply cannot refuse anymore, and Louis Zamperini's story is the clearest proof of that truth in American military history. Before the war, he was known for speed, not endurance. A middle-distance runner who had competed in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Zamperini's talent was built on explosive bursts, on finishing fast. War asked something else of him entirely. It asked him to survive slowly, hour after hour, with no finish line in sight. On May 27, 1943, his B-24 bomber, nicknamed the Green Hornet, went down in the Pacific Ocean during a search and rescue mission. Of the 11 men aboard, only 3 made it into life rafts. One of them would not last the month. What followed was not a rescue story. It was an erosion story. Zamperini, pilot Russell Allen Phillips, and tail gunner Francis McNamara drifted for weeks with almost nothing, a few chocolate bars, some malted milk tablets, rainwater collected in canvas when the sky allowed it. The Pacific gave them saltwater burns, sunstroke, and company they never asked for. Sharks circled the rafts constantly. Not occasionally, constantly. They bumped the rubber hulls at night, tested the men's nerve as much as their flesh, and turned every hour of rest into a calculation of risk. Zamperini later described fending them off with an oar, which sounds almost absurd until you understand there was no other option. Absurdity, out there, was simply Tuesday. McNamara died on day 33. Zamperini and Phillips kept drifting, past the point where most physiology textbooks would predict survival was possible. By day 47, they had traveled roughly 2,000 miles across open ocean, and they were spotted, not by an American ship, but by the Japanese military. Here is where the irony sharpens into something almost unbearable: 47 days spent outlasting starvation, dehydration, and sharks, only to be delivered directly into a prisoner of war camp. Survival, in Zamperini's case, was not an ending. It was a transfer from one form of suffering to another, arguably crueler one. What kept him alive on that raft was not luck, and it was not simple stubbornness either. Survivors of prolonged ordeals at sea consistently describe the same mechanism. The mind narrows its focus to the next hour, then the next, refusing to calculate the full distance of what remains. Zamperini's endurance came from exactly that kind of discipline, a runner's pacing instinct, applied not to a track, but to raw survival itself. His raft ordeal is often treated as the whole story. It wasn't. It was the opening chapter of something far darker, because the men who found him were about to test whether 47 days at sea had been the easy part. The 2 men who pulled Zamperini and Phillips from the water were not rescuers in any sense the word usually implies. They photographed the survivors for propaganda before offering them water, a detail that tells you everything about what came next. Zamperini would spend the following 2 years moving between prison camps, singled out repeatedly because his Olympic background made him valuable as a symbol, a former athlete the enemy could parade, break, and put back on display. The raft had tested his body. The camps tested something closer to his identity. There is a particular cruelty in surviving the improbable only to discover that survival bought you nothing but a different kind of trial. Zamperini would later say the ocean took 47 days from him, but the years afterward took something harder to name, and yet he came home. That fact alone, stripped of sentiment, is the part worth sitting with, not that he suffered, but that suffering of that scale did not have the final word. Roger Locker. There is a particular loneliness that has no equivalent on solid ground, the kind that begins the instant a parachute opens over enemy territory and the aircraft that carried you disappears into the distance without you. On May 10, 1972, Air Force pilot Roger Locker ejected from his F-4 Phantom after it was shot down deep inside North Vietnam, roughly 75 miles from the nearest friendly position. His weapons officer was captured almost immediately. Locker was not. He landed in dense jungle, alone, with no radio contact confirmed, no extraction plan, and no realistic expectation, even from his own command, that he was still alive. For the first several days, survival meant something almost animal: staying still, staying hidden, resisting the instinct to move toward anything that looked like help, because in that stretch of North Vietnam, help was exactly what could get him killed. He ate what the jungle offered, which was almost nothing. He drank from streams he had no way to purify. He listened, constantly, for the sound of search patrols that weren't looking for him, because officially, after enough days pass without contact, a downed pilot stops being a rescue priority and starts being a loss the Air Force has to accept. That is the detail people rarely sit with. Somewhere around day 10 or 11, Locker would have understood, the way anyone in his position would understand, that the search for him had likely ended. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because that is simply how it works. Command moves on. Paperwork moves on. The war does not pause for one man in the trees. Think about what that does to a person. Not the hunger, not the exhaustion, those are survivable in the short term. It's the specific, quiet horror of realizing the world you belong to has, by necessity, filed you as gone. Anyone who has ever felt truly forgotten in a moment of crisis, even in a much smaller way, understands a fragment of what that silence must have felt like. And yet Locker kept moving, kept hiding, kept himself alive on instinct and discipline long after hope would have been the rational thing to abandon. 23 days passed this way. 23 days of a man effectively erased from the operational math of his own war, refusing to accept the erasure. On day 22, something changed. American aircraft happened to be operating in the region for an unrelated mission, and Locker, hearing radio chatter on a survival radio he'd managed to keep functioning, broke in and identified himself. The pilots who received that transmission didn't believe it at first. Why would they? Everyone had already accepted he was gone. What happened next became one of the largest single-day rescue operations of the entire war. More than 100 aircraft were redirected to protect and extract one man, deep in hostile territory, because a handful of pilots refused to write him off a second time. Locker was pulled out on May 2, 1972, weighing barely more than 100 pounds, having survived on nothing but wool and terrain for over 3 weeks. There's something worth sitting within that number, 100 aircraft, mobilized for one life, after that life had already been quietly written off once. It says something about what people are willing to do when someone refuses to stop signaling, even from what looks like total silence. That's really the through line of every story in this video, not that these men avoided fear, or hunger, or the belief that they'd been forgotten, but that none of them let that belief become the final word. Locker's 23 days in the jungle prove something almost stubbornly simple: as long as you keep transmitting, someone, somewhere, might still be listening. If stories like this one are worth your time, the real ones, the ones history almost lets slip past, this channel exists to keep finding them. Subscribing helps more of these accounts reach the people who'll actually sit with them, so if that's you, consider joining us before we head into the next story, because what happened aboard the USS Indianapolis makes even this ordeal look almost merciful. USS Indianapolis. Just after midnight on July 30, 1945, the USS Indianapolis was sailing alone through the Philippine Sea, having just completed a secret mission that would help end the war, delivering components for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. No escort. No warning. Just open water and roughly 1,200 men who had no idea they were minutes from becoming part of the worst shark attack in recorded history. 2 torpedoes from a Japanese submarine struck the hull within seconds of each other. The ship began sinking almost immediately, not over hours, but in about 12 minutes. Men went into the water with barely any life jackets distributed, many without rafts, many without even the chance to grab something buoyant. Roughly 900 sailors made it into the ocean alive. What they didn't know yet was that the water itself was about to become the enemy. Here is the detail that makes this story almost impossible to sit with calmly, because the mission had been classified. No one on shore knew the Indianapolis was overdue. There was no search initiated. No alarm raised. The survivors floated in open ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest landmass, with the full knowledge that nobody was coming, because nobody yet knew they were missing. For the first day, there was something almost resembling order. Men clustered in groups, shared what little floated with them, rationed hope the way you'd ration water. That fragile calm didn't last. Within 24 hours, the sharks arrived, oceanic whitetips, drawn by blood, by noise, by the sheer number of bodies suspended in open water with nowhere to go. What followed over the next 4 days defies easy description. Survivors would later recall the screams coming at intervals, sometimes far off, sometimes close enough to reach out and touch. Men disappeared beneath the surface without ceremony, without time to react. Others succumbed to saltwater poisoning, hallucinating fresh water where there was none, drinking seawater against every piece of training they'd ever received, and dying because of it. The ocean did not attack all at once. It attacked patiently, in shifts, for 5 days straight. By the 3rd day, the numbers had already collapsed by more than half. Men held onto each other, held onto debris, held onto nothing but the stubborn refusal to let go, because letting go, in that water, meant one thing very quickly. Then, on August 2nd, something almost accidental happened. A Navy pilot on a routine patrol spotted an oil slick and, out of simple curiosity, dropped lower to investigate. What he found were survivors, hundreds of men, for days into an ordeal no one on land even knew was happening. He radioed it in immediately, and rescue ships were redirected within hours. Of the roughly 900 men who went into the water alive, only 316 came out. It remains the single greatest loss of life from shark attacks in U.S. naval history, not because sharks are uniquely drawn to warfare, but because 5 days of exposure, exhaustion, and desperation created exactly the conditions those animals are built to exploit. What makes the Indianapolis different from every story before it in this video isn't the water, or the sharks, or even the 5 days. It's the silence beforehand, the fact that survival, here, depended entirely on someone noticing an accident from the air, because the system meant to notice had already failed. Sometimes the ocean isn't the only thing that can forget you're out there. Marcus Luttrell. A wounded animal, cornered on a mountainside with no path back to the pack, doesn't calculate its odds. It simply keeps moving, because stopping is the only option that guarantees the end. That instinct, raw, unthinking, built into anything that has ever fought to stay alive, is the closest metaphor for what Marcus Luttrell endured in the mountains of Afghanistan in June 2005. He was one of 4 Navy SEALs inserted into the Hindu Kush for Operation Red Wings, a reconnaissance mission targeting a senior Taliban commander. The plan unraveled almost immediately. Local goat herders stumbled onto the team's position, and after a brief, agonizing debate about what to do with them, the SEALs released the herders rather than execute unarmed civilians, a decision that cost them their cover within hours. By nightfall, the team was surrounded by a far larger enemy force on terrain that offered almost nothing in the way of defense. What followed was one of the most lethal firefights in modern SEAL history. Luttrell's 3 teammates, Michael Murphy, Danny Dietz, and Matthew Axelson, were killed in the battle, alongside 16 more service members aboard a rescue helicopter shot down while attempting to reach them. Luttrell survived only because the blast from a rocket-propelled grenade threw him down the mountainside, away from the fighting, badly wounded and alone. That's the part worth sitting with before the survival story even begins. He didn't walk away from that mountain as the strongest, or the luckiest in any simple sense. He walked away because an explosion happened to throw him in the one direction that gave him a chance. Survival, here, started with something closer to physics than heroism. What came next was 7 miles of movement through hostile terrain with a fractured back, shrapnel wounds, and a body running almost entirely on nervous system rather than strength. Luttrell crawled where he couldn't walk. He hid in crevices. He went without food or clean water for days, evading Taliban search parties who knew exactly which direction to look. And then, in a detail almost too improbable for how brutal everything before it had been, a Pashtun villager named Muhammad Gulab found him and made a decision that put his entire family at risk. He invoked Pashtunwali, an ancient tribal code obligating hospitality and protection to anyone who asks for it, even an enemy soldier. Gulab hid Luttrell in his village, fought off Taliban demands to hand him over, and held that position for days while the mountains outside stayed lethal. Reflect on what that actually required. Gulab owed Luttrell nothing, not loyalty, not history, not even a shared language most of the time. He extended protection because a code older than the war itself told him to, and he kept extending it even as the cost of doing so climbed by the hour. Luttrell was eventually rescued days later, the sole survivor of a 4-man team, alive because a stranger decided an old rule mattered more than the danger of honoring it. There's a temptation to file this story under simple heroism and move on, but that undersells what actually happened on that mountain. Luttrell's survival wasn't a triumph of strength over impossible odds in the way these stories often get flattened into. It was a chain of small, specific decisions, a blast that threw him clear, a body that kept crawling past the point where quitting would have been forgivable, a villager who chose principle over safety, that had to hold every single link for one man to make it home. 4 stories. 4 different oceans of suffering, literal ones, jungle ones, mountain ones, and one thread running underneath all of them. None of these men survived because they were fearless. They survived because they kept moving, kept signaling, kept refusing to accept that the story was already over, even when every reasonable measure said it should have been. That's not a lesson wrapped in a bow. It's just what the record shows, over and over, when you look closely enough at the people who made it back. Which of these 4 survival stories hit you the hardest? Let us know below, and stay close, because the next video is already waiting for you.